The original Silent Hill 2 has developed an almost mythical reputation in the years following its release, back in 2001. When the game first came out, it was definitely quite praised, but based on how people talk about it now, you might be surprised to know that a somewhat small group of Silent Hill fans actually didn't care for it much back then. Some people complained about the game lacking the presence of the cult from the first game, and some simply didn't think it was all that scary. Creepy and atmospheric, sure, but scary, not so much. Essentially, there was a group of players who thought the first game was still much better, which is not a terribly rare thing to happen when a sequel comes out. But once that initial response died down, people began to approach the game with a more analytical and scrutinizing eye, eventually coming to the conclusion that so many people agree on today. Silent Hill 2 is a psychological horror masterpiece. It's crammed with so many thoughtful and deliberate details and so many things to say about the mental and emotional state of every single character in the cast and every single interaction they have. It's no wonder that it became the darling of so many YouTube video essays. No matter how many years have passed, there's just so much to talk about. So imagine the response when it was finally revealed, 21 years after the game's release, that it would be getting a remake. And not by a reuniting Team Silent who made the first 4 games in the series, but by Polish game studio Bloober Team. To say it was controversial would be an understatement. Bloober Team's gamography until that point contained only games that were considered flawed yet decent at best, and that's when they weren't drumming up further controversy for how these games handled the execution of their messaging regarding certain heavy topics and themes. Basically, Silent Hill fans who were familiar with Bloober Team felt nothing but sheer dread at the idea they were handling the remake of the most nuanced horror game ever made. In fact, back when the remake wasn't even announced yet and only rumored to exist, people were already voicing their concern and displeasure. And I'll admit, I had my own apprehensions too, but I also can't deny I felt a little sorry for them. It must have been incredibly demoralizing to see such furious denial of a work you haven't even announced yet, let alone released. And that vitriol did not die down at all once the reveal actually happened. If anything, it grew worse, to the point where even I felt some people were being kind of ridiculous, even though I was also doubtful of the game. Bloober Team being Konami's chosen studio for the remake is only just part of the anger too. Another big reason for the frustration is the fact that the original Silent Hill 2 is not available on modern platforms, so the only way to obtain it is by buying a second-hand copy or resorting to piracy. The former is an okay solution if you still have a working PS2 or Xbox, or if your current PC still has a disk drive and you can just install the Enhanced Edition mod for modern optimization. But that's after getting over the high, sometimes insane, second-hand prices that people are asking for. If you don't feel good about pirating, then the last desperate option is playing the HD collection version, which no fan would recommend because that version is created from an older build of the game and is plagued by numerous issues that I just can't even be bothered to list here. Despite being called Silent Hill 2, that HD collection version is just not the same game that released in 2001. The common excuse for the HD collection's awful quality is that the source code for both Silent Hill 2 and 3 are lost, and that likely is true, but that didn't stop other games from that generation receiving good re-releases, such as Kingdom Hearts, which basically had to be remade for the HD remix, because many of the original assets were gone. What I'm trying to say is, Konami was just being lazy and cheap at the time. They absolutely could have put in the work to adequately recreate the original 2001 experience, but chose not to. They could have made the HD collection a good investment, but they cut as many corners as they thought they could get away with, and the result was an unequivocally inferior pair of games. And all the pain still doesn't stop there. The last kick to the stomach Silent Hill fans had to endure was the infamous cancellation of Silent Hills by Kojima Productions after the legendary game creator Hideo Kojima was unceremoniously booted out of Konami. This was a big deal because PT, which served as a taste of what kind of game Silent Hills was aiming to be, was such an immensely well-received little game that it basically spawned a new subgenre of horror games despite being just a 20-minute proof of concept. Silent Hills was to be directed by Kojima and filmmaker Guillermo del Toro and have monster designs by legendary mangaka Junji Ito and star actor Norman Reedus as the main character. So yeah, it shouldn't be a surprise that the cancellation of such an incredibly promising project would piss a lot of people off, especially when the Silent Hill franchise was finally due for something interesting. I've seen people say the idea that Silent Hills would not have been very Silent Hilly simply judging by PT, but in my very honest and frank opinion, every Silent Hill after 4, except maybe Shattered Memories, felt like their entire personality was trying and mostly failing to recapture the magic of the Team Silent games. So I would argue the series was in a place where it was in dire need of something that would not end up feeling like dollar store Silent Hill 1 or 2. So to sum it all up, Silent Hill, the franchise itself and the discourse around it, was in a horrible situation, particularly from 2015 and on. And now we're here, at the release of the anticipated, or dreaded, Silent Hill 2 remake. The expectations are simultaneously monumental because of the source material and under the dirt because of the studio working on this project. But did they actually screw it up like so many people thought they would? Well, I played the game, I finished it, and now it's time to talk about it. So let's finally finish this long-winded preamble and dive into the review. Silent Hill 2 follows James Sunderland, a man who has been called to the foggy, gloomy, lakeside New England town of Silent Hill by a letter from his wife, Mary. But it couldn't be from her because, in his own words, she passed away due to illness 3 years prior. He still takes the opportunity to look for her and, in doing so, encounters hostile monsters and other normal people seemingly stuck in Silent Hill, experiencing their own strange living nightmare. There's Angela, a very jumpy young woman who seems to be searching for her mother. Eddie, a man who keeps getting caught in situations he claims have nothing to do with him. And Laura, a little girl who acts as if nothing is strange about her surroundings at all. James must navigate the streets and buildings of this hostile town and interactions with these odd fellow visitors on his journey to finding answers regarding the whereabouts and fate of his allegedly deceased spouse. Normally, this is where I would go into further detail about and my opinions on the story and characters, but since this is a game that's extremely detail-oriented, I'll save the specifics for the spoiler section later in the video. But there will still be light spoilers throughout the actual review, so keep that in mind if you want to continue watching. However, what I can say right this moment is that, thankfully, the entire cast is indeed very well acted, showcasing their innermost demons and vulnerabilities in a way that stays true to their backgrounds. But the star of the show, who still manages to perform head and shoulders above everyone else, is Luke Roberts as James Sunderland. I seriously cannot stress enough how amazing he is in this game. He knocks it out of the park, taking the heavily idiosyncratic acting of Guy Seiichi in the original game and turning it into a much more naturalistic performance without sacrificing a single iota of nuance or emotion. If anything, the nuance is bolstered thanks to the more sophisticated motion and facial capture of today. Luke's performance as James is almost paradoxical in the sense that he somehow manages to come off as simultaneously more selfish and hypocritical, yet also more sympathetic. Even before anything is revealed about his background, you get the sense that he's not being completely honest about things. Yet it's also very clear that he desperately misses his wife and tries to be a good person in his interactions with others, even though he doesn't always succeed. A very common source of apprehension in regard to remaking Silent Hill 2 is how a modern studio would mess up voice acting and acting direction because, according to Seiichi himself in interviews, Team Silent was extremely detailed and deliberate in voice direction, all the way down to wanting emphasis on specific words in the recording booth. The result was a very stilted, unnatural, and yet appropriately dreamlike delivery on lines from the cast. And while voice acting like that probably would not have flown in any other type of game, it worked superbly in Silent Hill 2, because it captured the very half-awake atmosphere of the narrative and supported the idea that James, Angela, and Eddie were all called to Silent Hill and are there somewhat against their will, but being pulled along by a force they can't explain. The acting in Remake manages to still capture that sinister implication extremely well, while still having the same amount of consideration put into every line of dialogue, with the cast delivering a more realistic performance that sounds more intentional and less incidental. I'm not going to say that it's necessarily better this way, because I still do really enjoy the acting of the original, but I absolutely feel that the more naturalistic delivery of the remake cast still works great for this story, which is a hell of an accomplishment considering how many people thought that a remake with experienced actors would just never work. After performances, another primary concern was art direction, atmosphere, and sound design. Even if some people didn't consider the original Silent Hill 2 to be all that scary, it was still undeniably a heavily atmospheric game, visually and sonically. Honestly, as much flack as Bloober Team catches for the gameplay, themes, or writing of their games, I don't think I ever felt that visuals were a weakness of theirs. But luckily for them, the two returning names from the original Team Silent who would be helping them craft a worthwhile remake are creature designer Masahiro Ito, who also had input for general art and environmental design, and composer Akira Yamaoka. Even when people were extremely reluctant about the studio pulling this project off, having these two men there was a small gleam of hope. The most pronounced visual characteristic of Silent Hill games is the impenetrable fog of the outdoor streets of the town, and its desolate mood and decaying features that make it look like no one's lived there in decades, despite all evidence in the environment suggesting that it was once a busy place. It's not aggressively terrifying, but instead consistently unsettling. And just like the performances, the town itself felt like it was teetering between dream and reality. Bloober Team managed to nail the appearance and tone of this version of Silent Hill perfectly. The fog, which is beautiful from a technical standpoint, is downright intrusive, preventing you from seeing more than maybe 20 or 30 feet in front of James's own face. It's hard to gauge when or if something will emerge from the veil of fog in front of you, and it turns the otherwise simple layout of the town into a daunting labyrinth you feel like you'll get lost in if you're not checking your map every 5 seconds. And then there's the otherworld version of Silent Hill, which is a far more grotesque and rotten version of the town that James enters periodically through his journey. It's less eerie, but much more sinister. This is where the art direction of the game kind of deviates a bit, because the aggressive decay used in this version of the town is more reminiscent of the first Silent Hill game's iteration of the Otherworld. This is a decision that could be met with disapproval depending on who you ask, because it could make the setting feel more distant from the extremely personalized hell that Silent Hill is supposed to be for James specifically. That being said, the detail in this version of Silent Hill is incredible, and if this were a remake of the first Silent Hill game, it would be a perfect rendition of the Otherworld that Harry Mason sees. Then you have character and enemy models, all of whom stay very loyal to the appearance of their original counterparts, just with increased detail. And when I say increased detail, I mean it. Bloober Team actually does use the higher graphical fidelity of current-day PCs and consoles to add detail to characters and enemies. For example, if you manage to get a look at Angela's fingernails, you'll see that they are completely mangled, suggesting that she bites them as a result of stress or trauma. There's a scene where you meet up with Eddie, and despite the urgent and dangerous situation he's in, you can make out that he's scooping up melted ice cream out of a bucket with his bare hands, heavily supporting his apathetic gluttony. Then we have audio. And let me tell you, the audio team was working just as hard as the art team was. As any good horror game will prove, audio design and mixing is extremely important to atmosphere, and as expected, a Silent Hill game does not skimp out on that. From the grotesque noises made by shambling and puking lying figures, to the shrieks of nurses, to the radio noise that can become deafening and stress-inducing when near an enemy, to the clicks and chirps of insects and creaks within the floors and walls, to the droning and clanging of the music, this remake has a sonic landscape that is just as oppressive as the visual one. There are times where the music ramps up and becomes really aggressive even though there aren't any enemies around at all, and it makes me really paranoid. Silent Hill 2 doesn't only use its unsettling sounds to set the mood, it also uses the absence of sound as the sentence that is punctuated when a sound finally pops up. Sometimes when you're roaming through a new hallway and slowly going door to door to enter a new room, the silence can be comforting because it means nothing hostile is near you. But then a sudden croak or chirp or gurgle can put you on edge, and the sudden rise of the static sound can suddenly make you tense up as you become hyper-aware of your surroundings in search of the enemy causing it. And half the time it's just a bug. Following all this talk of art direction and stuff though is the technical details, and this is where the experience is more mixed. I played the PS5 version of the game, so I had the simple decision between fidelity and frame rate modes. As you may already know, Silent Hill 2 is running on Unreal Engine 5, for better and for worse. The good news is that the game takes advantage of the engine's Lumen technology, which means that no matter which performance mode you're using, the lighting and reflections and shadows will stay present. They'll be a bit weaker in the frame rate mode, but they won't disappear entirely like other games that have to make huge graphical sacrifices for frame rate mode. The bad news is that the game suffers from a ton of visual artifacting, especially in fidelity mode and if you have the brightness kicked up just a little bit. Whenever something moves, it leaves a faint after image that takes a second to disappear. It's almost impossible to not notice sometimes. Also, no matter which performance mode you're playing on, the game struggles to stay at its target frame rate. In fidelity mode, the game doesn't stay at 30 frames per second, and will drop a few frames here and there. In frame rate mode, it doesn't stay at 60 and can drop all the way down into the 40s. And to add insult to injury, the game uses dynamic resolution scaling with both modes, so the frame rate mode drops down to resolutions below 1080p. Resulting in an occasionally fuzzy image. If you cannot stand fuzzy image quality and you can't stand a frame rate mode that doesn't even stay close to 60, then you might want to play in fidelity mode. But if you're willing to tolerate those things just to stay above 30 frames per second, then you might want to stick with frame rate mode. Sadly, there's no good choice here. Both modes leave much to be desired, and I do hope Bloober team irons them out a bit with an update in the future. In the meantime, there is something that you will be able to iron out yourself: my merch. As of right now, I have 2 shirt designs, a sliced skull and a tribute to Hironobu Sakaguchi, creator of the Final Fantasy series. I also have a beanie with my logo embroidered on it. Both shirt designs are available in lightweight fabric and heavyweight cotton. I've already received samples of everything for quality checking, and I can confirm they look great in person. If you're interested, visit mildconviction.com or check the store tab of my YouTube channel page. Thanks for listening, now let's get back to the review. Next, we have gameplay. It probably goes without saying, but this is where the biggest changes lie. The camera is no longer static, and controls are no longer tank-like. The original Silent Hill 2 had combat that was very traditional. It played almost exactly like how its closest competitor, Resident Evil, also played, but combat was far from its greatest strength. Now that's not to say a static camera and tank controls don't have their place. They do an excellent job at creating tension and claustrophobia when the player is navigating their way down narrow halls and small rooms. Ultimately though, the original Silent Hill 2's combat experience was still not particularly enjoyable, even if it was immersive and sometimes panic-inducing. Thus, the remake's biggest hurdle when it came to overhauling combat was to maintain that risk of sudden pressure and tension on the player when an enemy shows up, but also ensuring that actually fighting said enemy is not a chore to avoid and could actually be enjoyable. The remake adopts a very standard over-the-shoulder camera angle, getting the point of view very tight to James's back, especially when he's indoors. So even though the camera is in the player's control more than ever, you can still be surprised by an ambush right around the corner. Aiming and shooting feels exactly like how it looks. If you've played Resident Evil 2 Remake or Alan Wake 2, and you should, then you already know what Silent Hill 2 feels like. It's responsive and mostly reliable. I only say mostly because it's quite obvious that the game still wants you to focus on melee attacks when an enemy is within melee distance. It's pretty easy for gunshots to somehow go over or past monsters when they're within arm's reach. In fact, there's a few instances where I'm attempting to shoot a mannequin or lying figure with a shotgun, and the enemy is deceptively close to James, making the end of the shotgun just barely clip past them, and I end up shooting the wall instead. It is kinda weird, though it does not happen that often, because the game does condition you to rely on melee for a large chunk of the first act. I definitely recommend not even bothering with shooting at all unless the monster is several feet in front of you. As long as you follow that one tiny rule, you should be okay. Speaking of melee though, James has one new crucial little mechanic that makes survival much easier than the game's 2001 counterpart: dodging. No, James is not rolling around like a Dark Souls character, he's simply making a quick sidestep that actually does have invincibility frames, so you don't have to worry about where you're standing out of fear that your hitbox will still get grazed. You only have to worry about timing. And here's another thing about shooting that I haven't even seen that many people mention. You can shoot enemies in the leg to bring them down to one knee, which lets you run up to them and instantly knock them down and follow up with a hit or two for a quick kill. This is something I figured out on accident because the game doesn't even tell you you can do this. I know some people don't like the idea of James, the pinnacle of a normal everyman horror protagonist, having a dodge with iframes, and this was a complaint people had when the first gameplay trailer was shown off. But I honestly think it makes perfect sense. You don't need to be a trained operative or secret agent to simply step out of the way when a hostile creature attacks you. And honestly, James isn't particularly fast on his feet anyway. Despite improvements, the combat still contains that modicum of PS2 era jank. And if you let more than one enemy get close, they can overwhelm you, especially if you're not aware of your surroundings. It's not like James is doing backflips off the wall like a certain blonde pretty boy in that other remake of a 6th generation horror game that came out last year. Now, the combat being good is one thing, but the most important attribute for a true blue survival horror game is the exploration and puzzles. Silent Hill 2 has no shortage of space to walk through, whether it's the labyrinthine interiors of apartment buildings and hospitals, or the modestly relieving open streets. James will be moving around a lot, and you will be smashing his face into many, many locked doors, because this game has a ton of rooms for you to check out, both necessary for progress and not. Rewarding the player for exploration is the crux of the survival horror experience, and while the game doesn't have a particularly wide variety of items or weapons to use, there's certainly no harm in stocking up on what you have. I've seen some people express that the game throws a truckload of ammunition at you, but you can find yourself using them all up somewhat quickly if you're averse to melee. This scavenging and thoroughness is what really contributes to the lion's share of the playtime. This game is shockingly big, approximately double the size of the original game in basically every way. You can imagine my surprise when I hit 10 hours in this remake and I was still only about 3/4 finished. For what was originally a PS2 era horror game, that's pretty massive. People who play at a more leisurely pace and at a higher difficulty will probably hit 16, maybe even 18 hours for their first playthrough. Bloober Team greatly expanded the amount of content available here, but the weirdest and most amazing thing about it is that most of it doesn't actually feel like unnecessary padding. You would think that taking a tightly structured classic like the original Silent Hill 2 and literally doubling its length would utterly and irreversibly ruin its pacing to the point where everyone hated it, but shockingly, no. For the most part, the main locations, or dungeons if that makes it more clear, are very big and complex, but unless you're taking things particularly slow, you might finish them just before they truly start to overstay their welcome. This is a big deal coming from me because it's very easy for me to experience environment fatigue. I get bored of a location in a game the instant I feel like it's no longer throwing anything new or interesting at me. This does negatively affect a few games for me, especially RPGs that think it's a good idea to have a 5-hour-long dungeon with no variation in aesthetics the entire time. But somehow, Silent Hill 2 manages to avoid stoking that feeling in me despite doubling the length. Now, that being said, I would not disagree with each dungeon being tightened up a little bit more. Even though I didn't spend enough time in each one to get truly exhausted, I do believe that about 30 minutes or so could be trimmed from each one without harming the experience in any way. The two dungeons in this remake that come the closest to overstaying their welcome are the hospital and the prison. But out of those two, I'm more critical of the prison because of its primary gimmick of introducing a new variant of the mannequin enemy that can crawl on walls. It can make the area very creepy and turn it into a hellhouse that keeps you on edge the entire time. But depending on how you experience those enemies, that creepiness can turn into annoyance pretty quickly because of constant ambushes. It honestly feels like they were made to try and force you to use the ammo you've likely been hoarding up until now. In fact, I would even go so far as to say that the prison has too many enemies in general. This is a side effect of making the game twice as big. It also means there's at least twice as much fighting, and this means late game zones have a couple of obvious straight up arenas that spawn a bunch of enemies as soon as you do some key interaction. And some rooms require killing several enemies before you're even allowed to move on. And that type of room does feel a bit out of place in a Silent Hill title. The puzzles in Silent Hill 2 are great. I don't have a ton to say about them beyond that. I had puzzle difficulty set to standard, so none of them were terribly perplexing, but they were very engaging. I never once felt like a puzzle was obtuse to the point where I felt like I was just doing guesswork and crossing my fingers. They're all adequately worded to ensure that there's always something within the text that will get you through it. They're really intuitive and mostly fun to do. The real MVP of the game's exploration aspect, though, is the map. Exploring in a survival horror game is only as fun as the game's map is helpful, and this remake has quite possibly the best and most helpful map of all modern survival horror games thus far. As you walk around and gather information, James is constantly updating the map with crucial details, including which doors are locked, which doors are barricaded or locked on the other side, which rooms contain puzzles so you know to get back to them later, and he places check marks on rooms that have something important that you picked up, so you know you don't need to recheck it. He also writes down important hints on the map itself so you don't have to constantly bring up documents manually in your inventory. All of this, plus the map button simply being the up button on the D-pad so you can bring it up quickly and easily whenever you want to look at it, means this game's map is currently the best in the genre. The only remaining thing that would truly make it undisputed is if the map had some sort of way to tell you that you found all items in a room, like Resident Evil maps tend to do. If this map did that, then it would be the #1 gold standard for horror maps going forward. For the most part, this review is pretty much already done, but I want to dive into proper spoiler territory to also discuss some important things that fans of the original will want to know about, specifically more details about the characters and certain sequences, including endings. I also want to go over these things because it's slightly more of a mixed bag than everything else I've talked about so far. The remake adds fascinating new scenes scattered throughout the game, and there's also some scenes here that, quite frankly, I prefer here over the original. But there's also sequences here that fall flat compared to the original. So you are officially entering spoiler territory at this point in the review. If you wish, you can either skip ahead to my closing thoughts using the chapter function, or if you really want to, just exit the video entirely. Otherwise, feel free to continue on. One of the first things I did when I started the game was take advantage of the new camera to try and position it in a manner to look into the back seat of James's car, and lo and behold, it seems like Mary's body is indeed in the back seat. It was long theorized that in the original game she was in the trunk, but Masahiro Ito himself said that the intended implication was that she was actually in the back seat, and the remake took the opportunity to finally make this concrete. Obviously, the game doesn't outright state that Mary's body is in the back seat, but if you're on PC and use tools to decouple the camera from James, you can clip it into the car and see for yourself that the entire seat is occupied by something covered by a blanket. Furthermore, the remake has 2 new endings, only accessible by beating the game on New Game Plus. And one of those endings involves James sitting in the driver's seat, hallucinating Mary reaching out from the back to comfort him. This ending is called Stillness, and it heavily implies that James drives the car into the lake, but without himself in it like in the In Water ending. If you pay close attention to the audio after the scene cuts to black, it sounds like James exits the car before it moves forward. It's also another scene where Luke Roberts absolutely kills it with his performance. And the second new ending is called Bliss, and it's arguably the new, most depressing ending because it involves James taking a potentially lethal amount of hallucinogenics while watching the videotape in the hotel, and imagining himself in an alternate world where he never killed Mary. It's very pitiful and deliberately anticlimactic. I think both new endings are great and serve to satisfy other interpretations of James as a character. I think Eddie is portrayed perfectly in this remake, arguably just as perfect as James himself. Eddie's still the same guy he was in the original, a physically big but emotionally small man with a persecution complex. One of the best moments involving him that's new to the remake is when James runs into Eddie at the movie theater, and James makes a very benign comment about Eddie being able to keep his appetite despite the situation. James obviously did not mean anything rude by it, but for a few seconds you see Eddie silently seethe at the comment, shoot a brief but venomous glance at James, and put away the bucket of ice cream he was eating from as if he was suddenly ashamed. It's an absolutely excellent little exchange. Angela is also portrayed extremely well in the remake, and the actress does a fantastic job in the role. If I had to nitpick, I would say the scene in front of the mirror between her and James was just barely weaker here than in the original. But there is a new scene between the two of them that takes place outdoors, between the hospital and the prison, and it's also a great addition to the story and development of her character. The absolute biggest narrative improvement the remake has, however, is directly tied to Angela, and it's the labyrinth and the abstract daddy boss fight. The thematic delivery and overall direction and atmosphere of this sequence is incredible. It makes Angela's personal suffering even more impactful and tragic, and gives an even better look as to what her otherworld Silent Hill actually looks like. Endless hallways and rooms that look like her own home, a place where she's supposed to feel safe, but in fact is the most dangerous place in the world for her. Laura is great too, and an even bigger brat here than in the original, but the remake feels slightly stronger in its hints that Laura isn't experiencing Silent Hill in the same way the adults are, because she clearly doesn't sense any danger. As a kid, she doesn't feel soul-crushing guilt over anything in her life, so her version of the town is likely normal looking, but still weirdly empty. If there's one scene where I still prefer the original, it's the scene where her and James are in the hotel where he reveals that he killed Mary. I feel like I get just a tinge more anger and frustration out of Laura in the classic iteration. And finally, there's Maria, who, out of all the human characters, is probably the weakest, but that's not to say she's bad. Her scenes are still mostly great, and she comes off as more purposefully manipulative here, but I think there's a few moments where her delivery for some specific lines could have contained more vitriol. Maria is also tied to the one scene that I think is the biggest downgrade from the original, and it's the Pyramid Head chase. This is probably the one moment in the entire game where the new camera's over-the-shoulder perspective actually made things worse. It simply does not feel as urgent and frantic and tense as the original game's chase scene. And beyond all that are the hints at something stranger happening in Silent Hill. Now, for those who don't know, one of the more popular theories about the game in the last 2 decades is that James is experiencing some manner of loop where he's going through Silent Hill again and again in his own personal purgatory. Some people think the leave ending is the good ending where he's finally able to exit the loop. And some people think the in-water ending is the one that allows him to leave by ending things with his own hand. Regardless, the remake takes the opportunity to lean into this theory without ever actually saying if it's true or not. Throughout the game, you'll run into a number of small interactable scenes where the camera changes to a fixed perspective to look at something that was featured in the original game, such as rooms where something occurs but does not occur in the remake, or puzzles that James had to do in the original but are destroyed here. Even Maria comments on this by mentioning early on in the game that she's experiencing deja vu. It might not necessarily be meant to be anything other than something for players of the original to chew on for fun, but it's pretty interesting to see Bloober Team put a little bit more legitimacy to the theory without actually outright stating if it's a thing or not. And then there's the real elephant in the room regarding performances: the letter read. This is going to sound strange, but my perspective on the letter read in the remake is simultaneously harsh and very lax. To put it bluntly, it was bordering on impossible for anyone, even if they are a professional actor, to achieve the same magic as the original letter read. With that said, however, the voice actress still puts forth an overall great delivery. The one line she was unable to hit, however, is the most important line, the last one. As the closer to the letter, it was paramount that that one line was a home run, and she fell just short despite the rest of the letter being great. But I'm not holding it against her because, one, I think it would be pedantic and unfair to say that a performance that is still great is still not enough and therefore bad, and two, it was highly unlikely anyone was going to achieve what the original did in the first place. If I were to give a grade specifically to the letter read, with the original being an A+, I would say the new one is a B+, maybe an A- on a good day. And since I'm on the topic of endings, I might as well say that the prerequisites for certain endings is still kinda sorta obtuse. I got the Maria ending for my first playthrough, which really surprised me because I was deliberately doing things I assumed would get me a different ending, as well as minimizing the amount of time I spent around her. So there's definitely other criteria that takes a much higher priority here. Overall, Silent Hill 2 by Bloober Team is a shockingly successful recreation and expansion of the 2001 classic. It's nothing short of a huge risk to remake a game so deeply analyzed and admired, because every inch of your efforts are going to be painstakingly scrutinized by the people who have spent years replaying and discussing the original. I'm not going to pretend that I consider myself one of the people who knows the original like the back of my hand, but I admit I definitely was not sure Bloober Team could pull it off. and I'm glad they did. It's especially shocking that such a quality remake came from a studio that no one except themselves and Konami had faith in. I really cannot overstate how much disdain emerged from basically everyone once this remake was announced, but the results speak for themselves. Of course, it's not perfect. Frame rate is wonky, it suffers from typical Unreal Engine visual quirks, a few scenes don't hit as hard, and a couple dungeons are very close to dragging on too long, or perhaps they do drag depending on your own speed. But the strengths are still apparent. Powered by incredible performances from the entire cast, excruciatingly detailed environments, an extremely thoughtful script that only added content that deserved to be added, overwhelming atmosphere created by high-quality art direction and sound design, and greatly improved combat that is not an asterisk like it was for the original game. This remake absolutely justifies its existence. That isn't to say I don't wish the original were available in a better way, because I do wish that. I understand how off-putting it is for newcomers and frustrating for longtime fans that the original game is only available at an acceptable level of quality by either buying a second-hand copy going for twice its release price or by pirating it. It's a tragedy that such an important game is completely lost from commerce in such a manner. But if a person simply wishes to experience the story of James Sunderland, Bloober Team's remake is far from a bad option. As I was finishing this remake, it was announced that it sold 1 million copies in just shy of a week after launching. This is a number that a lot of people might think is minuscule, because we're so used to the biggest juggernauts in gaming selling that much in the first day. But don't be mistaken. 1 million copies in 1 week is absolutely astounding for the Silent Hill franchise. Before this remake released, the entire series, which includes 8 mainline games, sold about 9 million copies combined. Silent Hill was never very popular. In fact, it lost popularity as more games came out, because these sales are very front-loaded and every game sold worse than the last. Silent Hill 4 sold less than 3, which sold less than 2, which sold less than 1. So far, not a single Silent Hill game has hit 2 million copies sold, and it's highly likely that this remake will be the first to hit that milestone. And you know what? I'm glad for it. It deserves it. It deserves it more than any of the other Silent Hill games that came out after 4. Sure, maybe I'm being too harsh on the likes of Origins, Homecoming, and Downpour, but frankly, none of them came close to hitting as hard as this remake does. Speaking of older games though, the next question that many are pondering is, what's Bloober Team going to do next with this franchise? It stands to reason that Konami is going to ask them to remake another Team Silent title, but if they decide to do that, which one will they choose? It seems like the obvious answer should be doing them in order, 1, 3, and 4. In fact, the Otherworld sections of this remake might suggest that Bloober Team is gearing up to do Silent Hill 1 next. But I have a potentially controversial take. I personally think the next remake should be Silent Hill 4, because I think it would benefit the most from getting the gameplay of Silent Hill 2 transplanted into it. Silent Hill 4 has the distinguishing honor of being the last Team Silent game, but unfortunately, the gameplay aspect of it is far from great. The game has a lot of really cool ideas. It has amazing monster designs, great atmosphere, a fascinating villain in Walter, who is mentioned in 2, and interesting themes that help it stand out from the prior 3 titles. But it's bogged down by a frustrating gameplay experience, especially the second half. Then they could do 1 and 3 back to back, since they're the only ones that are directly tied to each other. Regardless though, I am eager to see what happens next with Bloober Team's involvement with Silent Hill. I'm also interested in getting more updates from other Silent Hill projects, such as Townfall and Silent Hill F, which were announced a couple years ago. Going forward, I hope this remake was not just some fluke, and other games managed to at least approach this level of quality. I didn't think it was possible, but I am actually optimistic about the future of Silent Hill. If you told me I would end up feeling this way at any point between 2015 to 2021, I definitely would not believe you. This concludes my review of Silent Hill 2. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you around.